Hi, I'm Shireen Gorbani, and you're listening to Both Sides of the Aisle. Normally, we have Natalie Gochner with us, who represents the political center, but
we are unsupervised.
We are unsupervised today. So I'm a former county council person, and am representing the left. I certainly consider myself a progressive. And who are you?
I do consider you a progressive. I'm John Dougal, state auditor, and I'm here on the right.
Yes. There's so much happening globally, nationally, locally. So we're going to dive right into some national news. What's standing out to you in the news stories this week, John?
Well, one of the key things that I think was getting a lot of attention was clearly we had this bill come out in regards to border security.
Yeah.
Or alleged border security, as the debate might have it on the right. So, let's talk about that. What were your takeaways? What do you like? What are you concerned with?
Yeah, so this is a long anticipated, very interesting piece of legislation. It has been, I believe, my entire lifetime. I'm in my 40s, early 40s, that we've really seen
you're not that old.
Meaningful immigration policy. So this
Folks would say since the mid 80s.
Since the mid 80s, so almost as long as I have been alive. And there is it's an interesting moment because I think typically you anticipate that either when you have full control, so Republicans in the White House, House and Senate with significant majorities,
a dream, isn't it?
or Democrats, that you would see finally some movement on immigration. But we're at an interesting time where we have a divided House run by Republicans, Senate just slightly run. Both have very slim majorities, but Senate is run by Democrats, and then we've got, of course, Joe Biden in the White House. But one of the things that I think is happening in the broader sense in communities across the nation is that immigration really is an issue where people want to see action. And I do think
and especially on border security, even more so than immigration, the concept of border security has really been heightened from my perspective over especially the last few years.
I think that's true, but I will say I think a big part of that is a particular media narrative that we're told, right? And I think we can get into some of those narratives, the veracity of those kinds of claims that we're hearing, and maybe some of the untruths that are being perpetuated. But I do also think when you kind of talk to everyday people, their sense that this is just a largely broken system, whether it is people who are trying to run businesses here who cannot find enough people to work jobs, whether that's in construction or in kitchens, across hospitality across our own state, right? Or when you think about people who hear these stories or have family members that simply cannot get their families reunified, that have these long waits on immigration processes if they're trying to do it legally. So we know that this is a broken system on many fronts. But there is, I think, an interesting moment where we're seeing this legislation come forward. I believe the text was released just on Sunday of
Sunday
the actual
night.
bill.
It's something 6, 7 o'clock Eastern time, Sunday night.
And the key negotiators, I would say from my side generally, Kirsten Sinema, Arizona, who's now an independent, but ran as a Democrat initially. Senator Chris Murphy is quite progressive. And then on your side, who's coming to the table?
James Langford.
How would you characterize his politics?
Historically, he's been viewed as very conservative.
Quite conservative, yeah. So what we're seeing here is a bill that proposes basically caps that would allow the border to shut down. But it also provides a number of other opportunities, I think, to improve systems that are broken. The wait time on asylum, so to increase the rapidity, how quickly people are processed with asylum claims. There are there's additional funding for border security more broadly. There are also, I believe, a whole set of different work permits that can be issued, especially in the asylum process, so that when people arrive, that they are able to work if they are granted asylum. Tell me some of the things that stand out to you.
So a couple of things that stand out to me is one of the concerns is we talk about catch and release, which is the concept which migrants claiming asylum, they're noted, told to come back to court. Sometimes that's 4 to 10 years.
Yeah,
that's a long time to say you got to go establish yourself in the country
without the ability to work.
With the hope that they'll actually come back to court.
Right.
And I know this bill talks about basically 90 days. I have some skepticism whether they will actually truly process it in 90 days, but I come from the perspective of, to me, this should be streamlined. This should be days to weeks. We shouldn't be looking to house or catch and release folks for even 3 months.
Yeah.
That just seems like a long period of time.
Yeah.
And stuff. And there's certain gates that make sure the process doesn't go too quick, which causes me concern. One of the other dynamics is I was looking at the bill, and I read through it first pass last night, so all 370 pages of it.
Yeah.
It looks like unaccompanied minors are not counted against the various caps that are in there.
Right.
And so therefore it's like, well, why are they excluded? Why are they exempted from the caps? And when I talk about the caps, it's at 4,000 migrants per day on average over a 1 week period of time, then the secretary may close the border.
Yeah.
If you reach an average of 5,000 per day, he shall or she shall close the border.
Yeah.
And one of the dynamics I have is okay, if you're going to close the border, there's another part that says, but you can't close it in the first year more than 270 days out of 365. So why do we have all those other days that we're not closing the border if we're hitting these limits?
Right.
And why is that? So this is where it looks like in one part it's supposedly cracking down. So it's got a good framework for some aspects, but it looks like it's got some loopholes. Are we really going to hit 90 days? What happens if we're not hitting 90 days? For me, there's some concern that's what's taking place. And then why do we say we're closing the border, but then we don't really close the border for extended periods of time? In the third year, they can only close the border for about half the year.
Yeah.
And I think as we talked last week, we were all in agreement of needing to know who's entering the country. That's one of the key things we can all agree on is we need to know who's entering the country.
Yeah, I think that's right. So from my perspective, this bill leaves a lot to be desired when we think about things kind of broadly in the conversation around immigration reform, or just the fact that we, I certainly agree that we're a country of laws, but we're also a country of immigrants, right? And so what is it, or how are we dealing with so many of the people who are already here? I think about Dreamers, right? DACA. There's not really anything to address that in this bill.
Yeah, I didn't see anything.
There's
about
nothing.
That.
So there are some real shortcomings from my perspective, but I would also say this to me feels like a return to some functionality. Do you think that we're going to see this bill passed? What do you think?
Well, let me ask you a question before we go
Okay.
there. One of the things that surprises me is I've heard a few interviews from President Biden.
Yeah.
And he's sounding very different than he did a few months ago.
Okay.
He's sounding much more militant about, I'm going to close the border and give me the authority to close the border. And I would say he's almost sounding kind of like President Trump was.
Yeah.
In regards to various border aspects. What is your read there?
Yeah,
what is your
I would
perception?
say it's a pretty, well, okay, so I do think he's being much stronger on it. And I do think he's asking for tools to address what we largely agree is a dysfunctional system. Some would say crisis, right? But I would say it's a long way to go between where Biden is right now on his language and the kind of language that Trump used when he talked about people coming to our border. I think there's a deeper sense of humanity in how Biden is approaching this, but I do think there is certainly a desire to say, if you get this done, I will use these tools to try to address this problem. But what we have on the other side, right, is...
before you go there, let me
Yeah.
I saw Senator Sinema on Sunday on one of the morning shows, and she was talking about the critical need to secure the border and how the current administration is failing in what it's doing. I think she was also taking Congress to task on its failings in regards to that. But yeah, when it comes to the broader bill, will this pass? There's a lot of hurdles in this.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
4 months in the works before it finally gets released, and a lot of people felt like they were out of the loop. A lot of senators felt like only 3 people were working on it. The rest of us just barely saw it. Senator Schumer saying we're gonna basically vote on it Wednesday is the message they're getting, which sounds really rushed for this. Okay, we just release it, now we're going to rush it through.
Sure.
And clearly, folks in the House feel like they're out of the loop.
Well, Mike Johnson has
already
said, yeah, it's dead on arrival.
Concern, dead on arrival.
So, and part of that, I think, is a response to what former President Donald Trump is saying. And for me, this is the absolute definition of politics. I do believe that Trump needs chaos at the border to be able to run on. I think he requires it. And so he's basically saying to Republicans, if you do not allow me to continue this problem to fester, then there are going to be punishments. And some of those punishments are already showing up. I do believe the Republican senator who was the main negotiator has been censured for working on it, right? Like there's all this kind of punitive response. I don't know. I'm disappointed.
One of my complaints with Speaker Johnson is for him wringing his hands and acting like they've been left out of the loop. For goodness sake, you're the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
Form your own working group. Form your own proposal. Don't sit there and whine about this. Come to the table with your own proposal and battle the Senate, battle the president on it. rather than just sitting there complaining.
It's true. Well, we've spent a lot of time here. So I'm going to shift a little bit to kind of this broader backdrop, which is presidential politics. So we are heading into an election. We've got Nevada. We're recording on Tuesday, so kind of today, kind of on Thursday. What's going on there?
Kind of confusing. We've got on Tuesday we have a presidential primary, and on Thursday we have a caucus, a presidential caucus. Historically, Nevada didn't have a very good turnout for their caucus meetings, so they instituted, I think it was in 2021, a primary. Now we end up with different folks. I think Nikki Haley's on the primary ballot, Donald Trump's on the caucus ballot. So it's kind of a little confusing what's really going to shake out of there. But those are the dynamics. And then we'll look for, we have the South Carolina Democratic presidential primary that Joe Biden, I think, got 96% of the vote.
That's
kind of
right.
A landslide there. Go Joe. No wonder he wanted South Carolina to go first. But we'll have the South Carolina Republican primary coming up really soon. I'm not sure why they didn't have the same day, but.
Yeah, that's right. And then we are just a month out from Super Tuesday. So a lot is going to be happening in this space. But I guess I would just say we're going to move from this conversation on national politics, bringing things right down to the local in our second segment. But I am Shireen Gorbani, and you've been listening to Both Sides of the Aisle. Stay tuned.
I'm John Dougal on the right.
And I'm Shireen Gorbani on the left.
And we're unsupervised.
Typically, we're supervised, not today. But you're listening to Both Sides of the Aisle. So we've been talking a lot about national news and the border. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that we also had our governor, Spencer Cox, join 14 other governors in Texas vowing to protect the border. Tell me just a quick kind of read on what you saw happening there.
Well, what I see is Texas feeling like they're getting inundated, that the federal government's not listening to them. A bunch of other Republican governors were coming down there to witness firsthand what's taking place and sharing in that concern that basically the federal government needs to step up and do its job when it comes to border security. If not, the states are going to step up and do something.
Yeah, that's right. So I know that he said that basically you can walk through downtown Salt Lake City and see the impacts of what's happening at the border here in our own city. But we did get some interesting news from Salt Lake City. Crime is down across Salt Lake City, which is good to know. And I think it's also really important for listeners to understand that fentanyl is a crisis in this country. It absolutely is. Drugs generally. We lose too many people in Utah and across this nation to drugs. But the way the drugs enter the border or across our border is typically not in the way that this kind of rhetoric describes, right? Like very often these are moved through in much more sophisticated manners, and it's not people who are just presenting at the border to cross. Would you agree with that general understanding that drugs aren't just flowing across our border with people who are seeking?
Well, there's different threats at the border. Clearly there's terrorist threats, there's drug cartel threats, there's migrant threats, and we've heard about drug subs and other things like that, or drugs getting shipped in cargo containers and other things. So drugs are entering our country of a number of ways. Yes. But fundamentally, it also comes down to, for some reason, Americans drive the demand for drugs because of their use. Yeah. If we didn't have the demand or we legalized other drugs, then demand would reduce for cross-border shipment of drugs.
Yeah. So when I see a display like this of our governor going down to the border and making a statement about the impact of drugs in our community, I, of course, am also looking then to our legislature to see, are we seeing bills? Are we seeing priorities around drug treatment centers, making sure that people have the kind of support that they need to get clean? And frankly, that's not always been the highest.
We stigmatize folks.
You bet
you have an addiction.
Yeah.
You can't talk about that, and you might be criminally prosecuted rather than this is an illness, let's get you treated.
Yeah, that's right. And I would love to see our state investing more there. We've seen some good movement there, but there's a long way to go. Our governor's also gotten into a little bit of a, I would say, interesting moment. It is Black History Month, and it's pretty typical. I would say it's sort of... often it feels a little hollow, but we see politicians very regularly making a statement on Black History Month or Native Peoples, Indigenous Peoples Days or whatever it may be. But he sent out a tweet that said, we honor the resilience, courage, and contributions that African Americans have made to our state and nation. We celebrate Black communities and remain committed to improving access to opportunity. As you can imagine, this did not go well, given the very recent signing of the anti-DEI legislation with really no comment. And in fact, him getting into quite a back and forth with our, institutions of higher education around the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think this is really, for me, a moment where I would ask people to think very sincerely about how little it means to post a statement like that when your actions betray the notion that you're trying to convey in that way. Just a word of caution, I would say, for politicians generally. I find it very irritating.
Well, and I get part of the dynamic. The DEI agenda, from my perspective, has run off the rails and doesn't fully accomplish what people claim that it accomplishes. But I think when it comes to Black History Month or other things like that, given my background, I need to be sensitive that I don't fully understand the experiences that others have gone through, and the challenges in their life and what they've overcome. I can look at Martin Luther King and appreciate his vision, his leadership, and stuff like that. But I need to be cautious because I don't fully understand, because I didn't walk in his shoes.
Yeah. A little humbleness and a little humility can go a long way in these moments. I do think it's something that I wish that we had more of in our politics. I had mentioned to John before this that I do a pretty good job of sharing local news on my personal Instagram account, and have been sharing just a lot of updates around what was happening with the trans.
I've been watching your TikTok videos, and they're not coming through.
I don't TikTok. But there's quite a bit to say about what is happening with the anti-DEI legislation and the trans bathroom bill. I just want to give a shout out to the people who have contacted me personally, and I think to all of the families that are impacted. It's really difficult for me to live in a state where what, for me, was really a fake crisis that was perpetuated around this notion that the people were largely unsafe in locker rooms and different places. And so we had this backlash, this anti-trans legislation passed, signed into law. And what I'm hearing from trans people is that this has actually created a very real crisis for them. And I just want to say that I think everybody in the state deserves safety, deserves to be treated with respect. And when we see legislation like this continue to roll forward, that I've said this before, but when we're in a culture war, there really are people who are caught in the crossfire of that. And I just want to let people know that I think we all deserve better, and that we deserve a kinder and more humble, perhaps a more humility-filled approach to our lawmaking.
I was even trying to throw you a lifeline about jumping over to social media companies and stuff
we
like
can,
that.
We can talk about that too. So I think that's a place where we see a lot of the division in our kind of body politic, and also just, between us and our neighbors. But what we had at the national level, a hearing where we had Mark Zuckerberg get up and apologize to people who had lost children and had been, the lives had been seriously impacted by the impact of social media. And then we also have Utah trying to lead in this space, last year passing legislation that would create further restrictions on social media platforms, especially as it comes to minors. But what are you seeing kind of on the landscape happening at the local level now?
So what I see happening in Utah is, one, they delayed the implementation of the bill. I'm hearing rumblings that they might be repealing the bill just because of First Amendment speech and constitutional concerns. Clearly, there's a part when it comes to social media companies. It's like, okay, where are parents in regards to what their children and their teens are doing? But clearly, I'm also hearing the concern from others that social media companies have intentionally been altering their algorithms to prey on people. Mm-hmm. And so that clearly is concerning. I don't have a lot of faith in Congress in weighing in on these things. Too often, I think these hearings are more for show than actually to drive substantive change.
Yeah.
Sometimes, to be blunt, I think it's a way for them to shake down and get more campaign contributions from these various companies than it really is to protect people. And I always caution folks to say, buyer beware. Don't trust that the government is going to help you or protect you. They might, but assume that they're not, even though they claim that they are.
Right. Well, let's jump from that to another piece of local legislation. So this is new. This would say that citizen-led ballot measures may be harder to pass. And the idea here is this is a pair of bills sponsored by Representative Jason Kyle out of Huntsville. The representative is suggesting that we would need a 60% yes vote from citizens on any ballot initiative that seeks to raise taxes or create a new tax, while most other ballot initiatives would only need a majority. Give me your read on this.
So there's always this concern, one, when it comes to taxes, making sure there's a heightened bar to get something passed. The other dynamic, though, when you have initiatives, is the concern that is, okay, does it really represent the views of the public? Just because you had a majority vote across the state doesn't mean it represents the positions of all the legislators and their districts. In the past, I've actually suggested a concept, which is maybe we should have one, I have concerns with just governing by initiative. I've moved here from California and watched the dynamics out there that's concerning to me. But if we're going to have an initiative, maybe it needs to pass, 1, in a majority of the House districts, 2, in a majority of the Senate districts, and then 3, statewide, because then we can check the boxes and say it's the equivalent of passing the House, the Senate, and the governor.
So I would say
it gets rid of that question.
Yeah. So I would say we already have a pretty laborious method by which citizen ballot initiatives make the ballot at all, right? The signature gathering has become more complicated over the years. There are higher thresholds and greater restrictions in place to make that more complicated. I think when I see things like this, what I think is this is basically just an ongoing effort to try to really consolidate power with the legislature. And to me, I say, if you want to do that, let's start talking about you winning all of your races by 60%. Like, why would we be moving these numbers around kind of arbitrarily? Maybe we should have a 60% state. I don't know. I don't think actually that's a good idea. But what I do think it is indicative of a society that's moving away from wanting to have people get into processes and to move things forward. I mean, a simple example of this is when we think about the way that our ballot initiatives work versus in many other places, it's not a constitutional amendment. It's creating a law, right? And then what we've seen in the past is that when we have these referendums that are these initiatives, citizen-led initiatives, that they often come to the legislature. And when we think about the things like access to medical marijuana or better boundaries, then the legislature just decides to do something else anyway. So to me, this seems like just kind of another effort to decrease the public's participation.
And you threw 2 words in there. Let me flag.
Okay.
So an initiative, just for folks to understand, this is passing a new law. A referendum is the legislature passed a law and we want to undo it.
Right.
And I'm one of those, I'm always concerned about an initiative, but I welcome referendum.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I like it.
Because I like the public to have veto, but I have a lot of concern when just somebody's going to run an initiative to create new laws.
New laws. Well, I'm grateful for them. I'm glad we have Medicaid expansion. I'm glad that we have medical marijuana in our state and others. So really quickly, I want to talk about another piece of legislation that I don't know if it's going to get much movement, but
what are the odds?
Yeah, what are the odds? So we're talking about the lottery. Lottery has been illegal in Utah since statehood, and a lawmaker is trying to move forward on the idea that Utahns want to gamble. So this
I
is
got $5 says it doesn't pass.
Representative Birkeland. Yeah, what do you think about things like this? These are often huge money makers for states. I think they're also quite detrimental to a huge group of people. But let's see what you got to say.
So from my perspective, first of all, I always refer to the lottery as the stupid tax. People that aren't well educated about the odds of winning put their money into it.
Yeah.
And so too often it preys on the poor people from my perspective, thinking that they're going to get something big. The other concern I have is I hear time and time again of it's going to create all this new money. It's going to let us fund public education or reduce property taxes or other things like that. And really what ends up happening is money gets shifted over and the taxes just still stay there and it supplants other money.
Yeah.
So it doesn't effectively do what people claim it's going to do.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about another tax cut as well.
Plus
in Utah.
Government getting in the lottery business, preying on people
Yeah.
to get addicted to gambling also is not a good idea.
No, I don't like it. In some somber news, I'd like to shift here at the end of our program to talk a little bit about Jan Graham. Jan Graham passed this last week. She's Utah's first and only female attorney general. She died at the age of 74. A Democrat, the last Democrat to win statewide election. She died on Monday night of ovarian cancer. And we just send our condolences to family and loved ones. And I just have to say that she's a person who stands out to me, especially when we think about what's been happening with our subsequent attorney generals in this state. She was really the last attorney general whose tenure was not marred by scandal. Tell me a couple of thoughts that you have or memories that you might have about Jan Graham.
So Jan was before my time, but clearly she set a legacy in Utah in terms of female elected statewide, in terms of her leadership. I know she's celebrated, especially on the Democratic side of the aisle and stuff like that. I wish her family well.
Yeah.
Appreciate her service.
Appreciate her service. And I think in a state, exactly as you're suggesting, where we just don't have that much female representation, it's really incredible to have the legacy of her and really running that office with such a high level of integrity and really contributing to the well-being of Utahns. Before we do that, I guess I just want to say we're kind of heading in here to the very end of the legislative session. What do you recommend?
Couple weeks left.
What do you recommend people do to stay on top of the news? Obviously, you're listening to public radio. Where are some other places you suggest people kind of follow along?
I tell folks to go off to le.utah.gov, as in legislature, le.utah.gov. You can track bills. You can see how they're going through the process when they have committee hearings. You can listen to committee debates. You can listen to floor debate. Pick topics that you care about and go inform yourself.
Get informed and also reach out to your legislators. I have to say, so often people say, I just didn't hear anything about that, especially certainly everybody kind of gets involved on these controversial ones, but kind of on the day-to-day stuff, it's good to let your legislators know if you support or don't support something and to start those relationships. I've been heartened by how good people are about reaching out when you are a constituent. So that's le.utah.gov. And I just want to say you've been listening to Both Sides of the Aisle. I'm Shireen Gorbani on the left.
I'm John Dougal on the right.
And our producer is Anthony Scoma. Thank you so much for listening.